In the shadow of the old Caldwell farm, where the wind howled through cracked boards like the cries of forgotten souls, Elijah and Silas had always been inseparable. Born just minutes apart, they shared everything from the air they breathed to the secrets buried deep in the loamy earth of their inheritance. The farm sat on the edge of a forgotten Maine town, a place where the trees leaned in too close and the fog never quite lifted, wrapping the world in a perpetual grey shroud. Folks in town whispered about the brothers, how they spoke in half-sentences, finishing each other's thoughts, their eyes holding a gleam that made you look away quick. But no one knew the depths of their bond until Amelia came along, a slip of a girl with hair like midnight and a smile that hid the bruises of her own haunted past. She arrived on a stormy autumn night, her car sputtering to a stop at the end of their dirt road, rain pounding the roof like insistent fingers. Elijah found her first, huddled under a sodden coat, her eyes wide with a mix of fear and defiance. He brought her inside, where Silas stoked the fire, his gaze lingering a beat too long on her trembling form. They fed her, clothed her in their mother's old dresses, and listened as she spun tales of escape from a life that had chewed her up and spit her out. In those early days, the air in the house thickened with something unspoken, a current that pulled them all together in ways that felt both inevitable and wrong. As weeks turned to months, the brothers' sharing deepened. Elijah courted her openly, his hands rough from farm work but gentle in their touch, while Silas stole moments in the barn's dim light, his words weaving promises that echoed Elijah's own. Amelia, starved for affection, surrendered to it all, blind to the storm brewing beneath the surface. The townsfolk noticed her blooming under their care, but they didn't see the nights when the brothers conferred in low voices, dividing her time like portions of a meal. And as winter clamped down, sealing them in with ice and isolation, the first whispers of unease slithered through the cracks, dreams of tangled limbs and blooded vows, hinting at a darkness that would consume them until nothing remained but echoes in the wind. The Caldwell farm crouched at the end of a rutted track that no map bothered to name, a place where the forest had been slowly reclaiming its own for 3 generations. Pines pressed against the sagging barns like silent witnesses, their needles muffling every sound until the world felt half-drowned. Inside the main house, time moved differently. Wallpaper peeled in long yellow tongues, and the grandfather clock in the hallway had stopped at 3:17 the winter their mother died giving birth to the twins. No one had wound it since. Elijah came first, red-faced and howling, Silas following so close behind that the midwife swore she felt only one body leave their mother's womb. From that moment they were never truly separate. They learned to walk by clutching each other's hands, toppled together like a single creature with too many limbs. Their father, a gaunt man who spoke mostly to the cattle, watched them with hollow eyes and said nothing when they refused to sleep in separate beds. Nights on the farm were cold, he told visitors who never stayed long, and 2 small bodies kept warmer than one. By the time they were 10, the town's children had already learned to keep their distance. The brothers moved in eerie tandem, finishing chores with a rhythm no one else could match, speaking in fragments only they understood. When one laughed, the other's mouth curved a heartbeat later. When one bled from a cut, the other pressed the same spot on his own skin as if sharing the wound. Their father drank himself quiet and died face down in the lower field one spring, leaving the boys alone with 40 acres of stubborn soil and a house that creaked like it remembered every secret ever whispered inside it. Seasons turned, but the farm stayed the same. Elijah and Silas grew tall and raw-boned, their hair the color of harvested wheat, their eyes a pale gray that caught the light like winter ponds. They needed no hired help, they worked as one organism, hands calloused in identical patterns, muscles corded the same way beneath sun-browned skin. At night they sat on the porch sharing a single tin cup of coffee, passing it back and forth without speaking, listening to the woods breathe around them. Something in that silence bound them tighter than blood, something hungry and ancient that had waited patiently beneath the floorboards since the first Caldwell staked his claim on cursed ground. They had no friends, no visitors, no concept of a world beyond the tree line where people lived apart and called it normal. Everything they owned, everything they were, belonged to both of them at once. The thought of division, of mine versus yours, never entered their minds. It simply wasn't possible. Not yet. The autumn of 1923 arrived early, stripping the maples bare and driving a wind that tasted of iron. On the 3rd night of relentless rain, a single headlight crawled along the washed-out track that passed for a road, sputtered, and died. The car, an old Essex with a cracked windshield, sat steaming in the downpour like a wounded animal, its driver's door hanging open. Amelia Hargrove stepped out into the storm with nothing but a carpetbag and the clothes she wore. 23 years old, slight as a reed, she looked half-drowned already. Her dark hair clung to her cheeks in wet ropes, and the lantern light from the Caldwell porch caught the tremor in her hands as she tried to shield a cigarette that refused to stay lit. She had been driving since dawn, fleeing a husband in Bangor whose fists had finally taught her that some doors only open outward. The money was gone, the marriage papers burned in a roadside barrel outside Augusta, and the rain had swallowed every plan she'd whispered to herself in the dark. Elijah saw her first. He had been mending harness in the barn doorway, oil lamp swinging from a nail, when the faint glow of the dying headlight caught his eye. He stood motionless for a long moment, rain drumming on the tin roof above him, watching the small figure struggle against the wind. Something in the way she moved, half defiant, half collapsing, stirred the air inside his chest like a hand closing around his heart. He set the harness down and walked out into the storm without a coat. Silas appeared on the porch at the same instant, drawn by the same invisible thread. The brothers stood on opposite sides of the yard, rain plastering their shirts to their skin, staring at the woman who had stumbled into the one place on earth where no stranger had ever been welcome. Amelia lifted her head, saw two tall shapes materializing from the darkness, and for a heartbeat she considered running back to the car. Then the taller one, Elijah, raised a hand, not in threat but in a slow, deliberate gesture that somehow promised shelter. She took one step, then another, until the three of them met beneath the dripping eaves. Up close, the brothers smelled of wood smoke and wet earth. Their eyes held the same flat grey light, reflecting the lantern like still water hiding depth. Amelia's voice came out cracked and small. "My car's dead. I've got nowhere else tonight." Neither brother spoke at first. They simply looked at her, then at each other, a silent conversation passing between them faster than words. Elijah reached for her bag. Silas opened the door wider, letting the warmth of the kitchen spill out into the storm. And Amelia crossed the threshold, trailing water across the worn floorboards, unaware that the moment her foot touched the braided rug she had already begun to belong to both of them. By spring the Essex had been towed away for parts, and Amelia's name appeared on the marriage register at the town hall beside Elijah Caldwell's. The ceremony was spare, a justice of the peace who smelled of pipe tobacco, two witnesses dragged in from the street, and Silas standing just behind his brother's shoulder like a shadow that had learned to wear clothes. When the ring, a plain gold band their mother had once worn, slid onto Amelia's finger, Silas's eyes followed the motion with a hunger so naked that the justice cleared his throat and looked away. That night the three of them sat at the kitchen table long after the single wedding cake had been cut and eaten. Rain tapped the windows again, softer now, as if the storm itself had decided to linger. Elijah poured whiskey into 3 cloudy glasses. The lamplight carved hollows beneath their cheekbones and turned Amelia's dark hair into spilled ink. Words came slowly at first, then in a rush. Silas spoke first, voice low, steady, without apology. He told her he had loved her from the moment she stepped dripping onto the porch, that the feeling lived in him the same way it lived in Elijah, that separating one brother's heart from the other was impossible and always had been. Amelia listened, fingers laced tight around her glass, watching the way the brothers leaned toward each other across the table, shoulders brushing as naturally as breathing. She had expected jealousy, accusations, perhaps even violence. Instead she saw only calm certainty, the same unsettling unity she had glimpsed in their work, their speech, their sleep. When Elijah reached across and covered Silas's hand with his own, the gesture was not reassurance but confirmation. What belonged to one belonged to both. Always. She felt the weight of the ring on her finger, warm now from her skin, and understood that the vows spoken that afternoon had been only half the truth. Elijah had married her before the world, Silas intended to marry her before God and the dark and whatever older things listened from the corners of the house. A silence settled, thick as honey. Outside, the wind shifted and carried the scent of turned earth through the open window. Amelia drew a slow breath. She thought of the bruises she had left behind in Bangor, of nights spent flinching at footsteps, of waking alone in cold sheets. Here were 2 men offering her everything they possessed, asking in return only that she accept them exactly as they were, joined, indivisible, complete only when together. Fear fluttered in her chest, but beneath it ran something warmer, more dangerous, the thrill of being wanted so fiercely that ordinary rules cracked and fell away. She lifted her glass. The brothers mirrored her without thinking. 3 hands rose together, 3 throats swallowed at the same instant. Then Amelia set her glass down and spoke the words that bound them tighter than any license ever could. Silas smiled first, a slow unfolding that reached his eyes last. Elijah's hand tightened briefly on her knee beneath the table, claiming and yielding in the same touch. In the hush that followed, the house itself seemed to exhale, boards settling like an old animal curling around new prey. The first summer unfolded like a fever dream that none of them wanted to wake from. The days were long and golden, the work brutal but shared 3 ways now, and the nights belonged to whatever room the lamp burned latest. They moved through the chores in a rhythm that felt almost holy, Elijah at the plow, Silas walking the furrow behind scattering seed, Amelia following with the harrow, her skirts tied up and her laughter drifting back to them on the hot wind. When the sun finally dropped behind the ridge, they bathed together in the creek, clothes abandoned on the bank, water sliding over skin that had begun to memorize every scar and hollow of the others. No one spoke of sin. Sin required distance, and distance had become impossible. At supper they sat close enough that their knees touched under the table, passing bowls in slow motion so fingers could linger. Amelia's body learned 2 different hungers and answered both. Elijah took her gently, almost reverently, his mouth tasting of the mint she grew by the back step. Silas took her with a quiet ferocity that left marks she wore like jewelry beneath her dresses. Sometimes one watched while the other loved her, grey eyes unblinking in the lamplight, and the watcher's breath would hitch in perfect time with the one moving above her. Afterward they lay tangled on the same sheets, sweat cooling, hearts slowing into the same cadence. Amelia slept between them, one brother's arm across her waist, the other's hand resting on his brother's wrist, as though even unconscious they needed proof the chain remained unbroken. For a while the arrangement felt miraculous. Amelia's cheeks filled out, her eyes grew bright, and she sang while she churned butter, old hymns her mother had taught her, now laced with a joy that made the words feel new. The brothers' perpetual silence softened, they teased her about burning the biscuits, stole kisses in the barn loft, argued playfully over whose turn it was to carry her across the muddy yard after rain. The farm itself seemed to approve, the cows gave richer milk, the corn shot up knee-high by the 4th of July, and the old house stopped its midnight creaking, as if it too had decided to hold its breath and listen. But beneath the ease, small shadows began to lengthen. Elijah would pause sometimes on the porch at dusk, staring toward the fields where Silas and Amelia worked side by side, a faint line appearing between his brows. Silas, oiling harness late into the evening, would look up suddenly if Amelia laughed too long at something Elijah whispered while they washed at the pump. Their touches grew fractionally sharper, Elijah's hand tightening on her hip when she leaned toward Silas, Silas's fingers digging briefly into Elijah's shoulder when Elijah pulled her away to dance in the kitchen. Tiny flares, quickly smothered, but each one left a scorch mark no one acknowledged. They still shared the same bed, the same breath, the same woman, yet something had begun to count. October came in cold and sudden, the way it always did on the ridge. One morning Amelia woke before the others, slipped from between their heavy arms, and stood barefoot on the chill floorboards while the first pale light crept through the curtains. She pressed both palms to her belly and felt the small, undeniable curve that had not been there a month ago. The knowledge settled in her like a stone dropped into still water, ripples moving outward, impossible to call back. She told them at breakfast. The words came out soft, almost apologetic, as though she had broken something precious by letting nature take its course. Elijah's fork stopped halfway to his mouth. Silas set his coffee down so carefully the cup made no sound against the oilcloth. For a long moment the only noise was the stove ticking as it cooled. Then Elijah smiled, wide and sudden, the same smile he had worn the night she agreed to stay. He reached across the table and covered her hand with his calloused one. Silas's smile followed a heartbeat later, smaller, tighter, but he nodded too, and the moment should have been perfect. It wasn't. That night they lay awake long after the lamp burned out. Amelia drifted between them, listening to the 2 separate rhythms of their breathing and realizing for the first time that they were separate. Elijah's hand rested on the slight swell beneath her nightgown, possessive and tender. Silas lay on his back staring at the ceiling, one arm flung above his head, the other curled into a fist against his own ribs. When she turned towards Silas in the dark, seeking the familiar heat of him, he did not move to meet her. Instead his fingers brushed the back of Elijah's hand where it lay on her belly, a contact so light she might have imagined it, yet it carried the weight of a question neither brother had ever needed to ask before. In the days that followed, the farm kept its usual cadence, but everything inside it had tilted. Elijah found reasons to ride into town alone, returning with small gifts, a length of calico the color of cornflowers, a jar of peppermint sticks, a tiny pair of knitted booties ordered from the catalogue. Silas watched him unload the parcels with the same flat grey stare he used on foxes near the henhouse. When Amelia thanked Elijah, voice bright with gratitude, Silas's jaw flexed and he turned away to split kindling until the axe rang like a church bell and splinters flew like hail. They still took her together some nights, movements practiced and wordless, but the old ease had curdled. Elijah's eyes sought hers now, searching for something only she could give. Silas's gaze fixed on his brother's back, on the hand that sometimes forgot to reach across her body and include him. And Amelia, caught between their mirrored hunger, felt the child inside her quicken as though it too sensed the fracture widening, a living secret that belonged to one man and not the other, no matter how fiercely they pretended otherwise. November stripped the trees bare and brought the first hard frosts. The farm settled into its winter hush, but the silence inside the house grew teeth. It began with small things, a door that shut itself though no wind stirred the curtains, footsteps crossing the attic when all three of them sat at the kitchen table, the sudden stink of turned earth rising from beneath the floorboards as if something down there had started breathing. Amelia noticed it first. She would wake in the dark to find the quilt pulled tight to her chin, though neither brother had moved. Once she opened her eyes to see a woman's hand, thin, blue-veined, unmistakably dead, smoothing the hair back from her forehead before dissolving like smoke. She told herself it was dreams, the child pressing on her nerves, but the marks remained, faint bruises shaped like fingerprints on her wrist the next morning. The brothers felt it too, though they spoke of it only in glances. Elijah began nailing horseshoes above every doorway, iron clinking against iron until the house sounded like a blacksmith's shop. Silas carried salt in his pocket and poured thin white lines across every sill at dusk. They took to sleeping with the lamp turned low, the three of them pressed close, but even that stopped working. One night Amelia woke to find both brothers sitting upright in bed, staring at the corner where the shadows pooled too thickly, as though something crouched there watching them watch it back. Then came the whispers. Not words at first, only breath shaped like words, sliding along the walls after midnight. Amelia heard her name sighed in a woman's voice she almost recognized. Elijah heard his own name spoken by Silas, though Silas lay asleep beside him, mouth closed, chest rising and falling in perfect rhythm. Silas heard Elijah laughing the way he used to laugh when they were boys and something small died in the barn, a sound that made the hair rise on his arms because Elijah had not laughed like that in weeks. The family Bible, thick with dust and pressed flowers, fell open one afternoon while Amelia dusted the parlor. A page no one remembered marking fluttered loose, a family tree inked in brown that might once have been red. Names repeated, Elijah, Silas, Amelia, across generations, the same three in the same order, each trio ending in a single date of death. Beneath the last entry someone had scratched, in a hand that shook, "We tried to keep her only for one and the house would not allow it." That night the temperature in the bedroom plunged though the stove downstairs roared. Frost bloomed across the inside of the window panes in the shape of reaching fingers. Amelia clutched her belly and felt the child kick hard, once, as if warning her. Between her and the cold glass, the shadows thickened until they had weight, until they pressed down on the bed like an unseen fourth body trying to slide between the three that already fought for space. December arrived with a sky the color of tarnished pewter and a stillness that made every sound feel like a gunshot. The thing that had been simmering between the brothers finally boiled over on the shortest day of the year, when the sun barely cleared the ridge before bleeding out again. It began over nothing and everything. Amelia, heavy now and moving slow, asked Silas to bring in more wood. Elijah, already at the door with an armload, answered for him, voice mild, "I've got it." Silas's axe paused mid-swing outside. Something in the way Elijah said it, easy, proprietary, the tone of a husband speaking for his wife, snapped the last thread holding Silas together. He drove the axe into the chopping block so hard the handle shivered and walked inside without a word. They met in the kitchen, Amelia between them like a fragile shield. Silas's coat was still on, snow melting from his boots in dark coins on the floorboards. His eyes, when they fixed on Elijah, held no grey calm anymore, they were bright and glassy with rage. "You think because the ring's on your finger she's yours alone now?" The words came out low, almost wondering, as if he were discovering the betrayal aloud. Elijah set the armload of wood down with deliberate care. "She's carrying my child," he said, and the pronoun landed like a blade. Silas moved first. Not a punch, something worse. He seized Elijah by the throat and slammed him back against the pantry door. The impact rattled every jar on the shelves. Elijah's hands came up, not to defend but to grip Silas's wrists, holding him there as if the contact itself could stitch them back together. Their faces were inches apart, breath mingling in white clouds between them. Amelia screamed once, a short sharp sound that died against the walls. She lunged forward, both palms against Silas's chest, trying to shove him off. Silas released Elijah only to round on her. For one terrifying heartbeat his hand rose, not to strike, never that, but high enough that she flinched hard, cradling her belly. The flinch broke something irreparable. Silas saw it, Elijah saw it, and the room filled with the sudden stink of shame. Elijah hit him then. A single blow, open-handed, across the mouth. Silas's lip split, blood spattered the front of Amelia's apron like thrown berries. Neither brother made a sound. They stared at each other across the small space, chests heaving, while Amelia backed against the stove and slid slowly to the floor, hands pressed over her mouth to keep the sobs inside. Silas touched his lip, looked at the red on his fingers, and laughed once, short, wet, broken. Then he walked out the back door without his coat and did not come back until long after midnight, bringing the smell of pine and blood and something colder than the night air. When he finally stepped inside, Elijah was waiting with a needle and black thread. They sat at the kitchen table in silence while Elijah stitched the torn lip, each pull of the thread drawing them physically closer even as everything else tore wider. Amelia watched from the doorway, one hand on her belly where the child kicked and kicked as if trying to claw its way out early. January folded the farm in iron and silence. Amelia's belly grew huge and low, the skin stretched so tight it shone like wet marble in the lamplight. She moved through the days like someone underwater, hands always cradling the weight that pulled at her spine. Sleep came only in snatches, broken by pain that started in her back and radiated outward in slow, deliberate waves. The doctor in town had shaken his head at the last visit. The baby was turned wrong, too large, and Amelia herself looked half-transparent, veins blue beneath the skin, eyes ringed in permanent bruise. The brothers watched her waste the way men watch a fire burn down to coals, helpless and furious. They took turns carrying her from bed to chair, boiling willow bark tea that did nothing, pressing hot bricks to her feet while frost etched the windows into fern. At night they lay on either side of her, palms spread over the drum-tight mound, trying to lend their warmth to the child that now seemed less a promise than a punishment. One evening, while Elijah was in the barn, Silas opened the old trunk in the attic that had not been touched since their father died. Inside, wrapped in oilskin, lay letters their grandmother had written to a sister who never answered. The paper cracked like dead leaves as Silas unfolded it. The words were frantic, ink blurred in places by tears or rain. They made the same bargain. My boy's grandfather and his brother took one woman between them and called it love. The house liked it at first, grew fat on the wrongness. Then she quickened, and the walls began to drink. They found her in the root cellar, belly torn open from the inside, the child gone, only scraps left for the rats. The brothers hanged themselves from the same beam the next night. The rope held both, side by side, the way they always were. Silas read until the lamp burned low, then carried the letters downstairs and fed them page by page into the stove. The flames took the words greedily, flaring green where the ink caught. Amelia woke to the smell of burning paper and knew, without being told, that the thing pressing on her lungs was older than any of them. That same night the bleeding started, slow at first, a dark stain spreading across the sheets like spilled molasses. She called out once, a thin sound swallowed by the house. The brothers came running, faces white as the snow outside. They carried her to the kitchen table, laid quilts beneath her, boiled water though neither knew why. Blood pooled beneath her hips, thick and black, smelling of iron and turned earth. Between her legs the child shifted, a sudden violent roll that tore a scream from her throat and cracked something deep inside. The brothers held her hands, their fingers interlaced with hers and with each other's, while the house groaned around them like a living thing turning in its sleep. The child came just after midnight on the last day of February, when the moon hung low and red above the treetops like a wound that refused to close. Amelia's screams had thinned to hoarse animal sounds hours earlier. The kitchen table was slick with blood and melted snow tracked in from the brothers' boots. Elijah held her shoulders, Silas her knees, both of them streaked crimson to the elbows, whispering the same broken prayers into her sweat-soaked hair. When the baby finally slid free, it did not cry. It landed in Silas's waiting hands, silent and perfect, skin pale as milk, eyes already open and the exact grey of its father's. A boy. Elijah cut the cord with the same knife he used to slaughter hogs, hands shaking so violently the blade nicked his own thumb. Blood from both sources mingled on the steel. Amelia turned her face to see, managed one trembling smile, then slipped into a stillness so complete the room seemed to hold its breath with her. They wrapped the child in a clean flour sack and laid him on Amelia's chest. She did not move again. For 3 days the brothers moved through the house like ghosts themselves. They washed her body with water warmed over the same stove that had boiled during her labor, dressed her in the white nightgown she had worn the night she first agreed to belong to both of them. They dug the grave at the edge of the family plot beneath the pines, taking turns with the pick because the ground was iron hard. When the coffin, rough pine boards Elijah planed smooth with his own hands, was lowered, Silas placed the child on her breast inside the box, still swaddled in the flour sack now stiff with dried blood. No priest would come so far out for a woman who had lived in sin. They spoke no words, only stood bareheaded while the wind whipped their hair and the first flakes of new snow drifted down like ash. Back in the house the silence was absolute. They lit no lamps. They did not eat. The baby's cradle, built months earlier in a fit of shared joy, rocked gently in an empty corner though no hand touched it. On the 4th night the child began to cry, a thin, reedy sound that came from nowhere and everywhere. The brothers found the cradle empty, yet the cry continued, rising from the floorboards, from the walls, from inside their own skulls. When they looked at each other across the kitchen table, they saw the same knowledge settle like frost. The boy had never truly been born into the world of separate things. He belonged to the house now, the same way the shadows did, the same way the old bargain did. And he was hungry. March arrived with a false thaw. Water dripped from the eaves in steady silver threads, and the snow pulled back from the foundations like a receding tide, revealing things that should have stayed buried. Elijah found the first mark on the morning of the 5th, a thin line of blood seeping from beneath the kitchen door though nothing living had crossed that threshold in weeks. He followed it across the floorboards to the cradle that still rocked though the room was empty. The blood ended there, soaked into the wood, darkening the grain the way sin darkens a soul. Silas began to waste. His stitched lip split again and refused to heal, the wound crawled with a black edge that smelled of turned earth. He took to sitting on the porch at night, coatless, staring toward the fresh grave where frost heave had already begun to push the soil upward in a small, obscene mound. Sometimes he spoke to it, voice soft, coaxing, the same tone he had once used to call Amelia from the garden. Elijah watched from the window, hands pressed flat to the cold glass, feeling the last tether between them fray and fray until only a single thread remained. On the 10th night the child's cry changed. It deepened, thickened, became 2 voices braided together, one higher, one lower, crying with the same lungs. The sound poured from the walls like smoke, filled every room until the brothers clapped hands over their ears and still heard it inside their skulls. They met in the hallway without planning it, drawn by the noise, and for the first time in their lives stood apart, a full arm's length between them, afraid to touch. Elijah went first. He walked into the kitchen at dawn, took the same knife that had cut the cord, and opened his own throat above the cradle. The blood fell in a hot red curtain, splattering the empty blankets, and the rocking stopped. Silas found him an hour later, already cooling, eyes fixed on the ceiling with an expression almost of relief. He knelt, pressed his forehead to his brother's, and felt the old pull, the need to follow, to finish every sentence, every breath, rise in him like tide. He hanged himself at dusk from the same barn beam their ancestors had used, not practiced and sure, body swaying inches from where Elijah's boots had left their last muddy prints. The rope creaked once, twice, then settled into the rhythm of a heartbeat that belonged to no one left alive. The house took them both before midnight. Snow began to fall again, soft and deliberate, erasing footprints, erasing everything. By morning the farm stood empty, windows dark, chimney cold. Only the cradle rocked, slowly, endlessly, while something small and grey-eyed watched from the shadows and waited for the next pair of brothers foolish enough to believe they could share what the house had already claimed as its own.